I'm sorry. What did he just say? I blinked hard, clutching my notepad like it was going to stop the room from spinning. Mason, slick hair, thinner tie than sense, all fake smile, LinkedIn energy, just looked at Evan and dropped it like he was reading a punchline from some self-help book for sociopaths. We control your career now, he said, smiling at the team. Honestly, an intern could do this job. Dead silence. I don't think Evan even flinched. 15 years in that seat, and he just nodded, collected his coffee mug. The one with the faded NASA logo he'd had since onboarding. The kind of mug that saw more late nights than Mason's overpriced espresso machine ever would. Then he walked out. No grand exit, no final words. Just out. I think my stomach dropped straight through my heels. I should back up. If you're already gripping the edge of your seat like I was in that moment, do us a quick favor. Like the video and subscribe. It helps way more than you'd think, especially since 97% of people watch these stories without ever subscribing. Thanks. It really keeps the team going. Okay, so Evan Krause. If you've ever worked in a place like Eastridge Solutions, consulting, contracts, chaos, you've met someone like him. The guy who doesn't say much in meetings but fixes the roadmap no one else understands. The guy who doesn't brag about his clearance level or his client list because he doesn't have to. The guy who, when the power goes out or the audit's off by 6 million, knows who to call. He mentored half the department. Built systems before the founders even had health insurance. When I joined as a junior project analyst, he was the one who slipped me the internal cheat sheet no one else shared, who actually had pull, what the real delivery calendar looked like, which clients to keep sweet even if the CRM said otherwise. He didn't grandstand, he didn't schmooze, he just delivered. So when Mason flounced in, all buzzwords and faux strategic diagrams, we all braced for it. Chief Strategy Officer. Titles like that only show up when someone's uncle owns the building and thinks you're a liability unless you have an app and a newsletter. Mason strutted through the halls like he'd invented efficiency, kept calling Evan legacy tech, and asked aloud if the systems Evan designed were still even in use. Of course they were. Half the company ran on them, but Mason didn't care. He was on a mission. First came the Slack channels being optimized. Translation, deleted. Then came the exec-only syncs that mysteriously never included Evan. I noticed the way Mason's eyes scanned Evan's notes in meetings, how he'd parrot his insights 5 minutes later with added synergy fluff. Evan never called it out. Just sipped his coffee like he was watching a dog try to drive a car, confused but not surprised. The thing is, we all thought Evan would be fine. He was the system, right? We whispered about it in private chats. How this was just another executive sweep, how Evan had survived worse. A few of us even joked about him outlasting Mason like he did the last CFO who tried to implement Agile by reading half a Forbes article. But that meeting, that gut punch of a Friday morning, it wasn't even a real strategy session. Just one of those performative stand-ups Mason held where he talked for 28 minutes, then asked for open feedback before logging off. Only this time, he stayed. And Evan was called up like he was about to receive an award. I'll never forget the way Mason's voice curled around the words, "This will be a difficult but necessary realignment. As of today, we're sunsetting Evan's role." Sunsetting. Not eliminating, not restructuring, sunsetting. Like Evan was a feature they were phasing out in a software update. And then the line. The "we control your career now" line, delivered with a smirk. Like he thought he just kicked the final boss off a cliff. I expected something. Anything. A flash of anger. A rebuttal. But Evan just nodded. Looked at Mason like he was a kid in a big man's suit. He walked to his desk, grabbed the NASA mug, his folder, and a battered blue notebook. Left without looking back. I stared at the doorway so long I forgot I was still holding my breath. No one said a damn thing. Not even Mason. Especially not Mason. That night, I couldn't sleep. My messages were full of coworkers asking the same question. Why didn't Evan fight it? I didn't know the answer yet, but I would soon. And let me tell you, none of us were ready for what came next. Over the next few days, the air in the office felt like static before a lightning strike. Charged and tense, but no one knew where the bolt would hit next. Mason moved fast. Evan's name vanished from the internal org chart within hours, his access revoked by lunchtime, his projects reassigned to people who didn't even know how to open half his databases. There wasn't an announcement, just absence, like the company was trying to erase 15 years in 15 minutes. Then came the meetings. Mason, in his custom-tailored smugness, started referring to senior staff as legacy costs. Said it like he was reading out of some twisted McKinsey playbook written by a frat boy with a LinkedIn fetish. He'd show up late to cross-department syncs, demand action items before the intro slide was done, and smile while asking VPs, "What value do you actually bring?" I saw 3 directors cry in the parking garage that week. One of them hadn't taken a sick day in 9 years. The thing about Evan was, he never played the politics game, never needed to. He was the game board. Everyone else moved around him, respectfully, quietly, but no one questioned that when a system broke or a contract stalled, Evan was the guy who got the call. And now? Mason handed those responsibilities to a 23-year-old intern who once asked if ISO 27001 was a new crypto. The same intern who, by Wednesday, had a full-blown panic attack after accidentally deleting a production file and restoring an old version from 6 months ago. I heard about it secondhand. IT scrambled for hours, the client threatened to sue, and Mason, he blamed a legacy process bottleneck. Said it loud, too, like it was a punchline. It was clear he wanted full control, not just over the structure, but over the narrative. Mason framed Evan's exit as streamlining, said it was the hard but necessary pivot into a leaner, future-facing operating model. If you think that sounds like nonsense, you're right. But that didn't stop people from nodding along like they understood. Fear does that. It makes cowards out of decent people. I'd never seen a workplace go silent so fast. Not even during layoffs. People started avoiding the 9th floor entirely. That's where Evan used to sit. Corner desk, second window from the west wall. He always left a pack of peppermints open for anyone who stopped by. It was a dumb little thing, but I'd catch myself looking for that dish every morning. Empty now, like everything else up there. The Friday after his firing, Mason strutted into the weekly strategy huddle wearing some ridiculous blazer that looked like it belonged to a game show host. He opened with a PowerPoint that had more memes than metrics, then launched into a monologue about breaking old cycles and killing sacred cows. That's when he said it again, right there, in front of the entire project team. "We control your career now," he said, smirking like he was proud of himself. And honestly, an intern could do Evan's job. I caught my breath. Someone coughed. No one laughed. He didn't even flinch when he said it. He just clicked to the next slide like he hadn't just insulted a man who held the company together longer than Mason's been alive. The worst part? No one said anything. Not a peep. Not even me. I think that's what broke something in me. Not the insult. Not the swagger, but the silence. The complicity. I watched Mason bask in it, mistaking quiet for validation. He thought he'd won. But here's the thing about Evan. When he left the building that day, quiet, mug in one hand, folder in the other, there was a look on his face I'd only seen once before. Years ago, during a particularly messy DCAA audit, the agency had found a clause in a contract that could have bankrupted us. Everyone panicked. But Evan? He looked exactly like he did when Mason fired him. Calm, still, calculating. Back then, he disappeared for 3 hours, came back with a legal memo and 2 witness statements, saved the contract, saved the company, then went right back to working on a deployment schedule like nothing happened. So when I saw that same look, I knew. Evan didn't leave defeated. He left thinking. And somewhere, in some quiet corner of a locked drawer or a sealed envelope, I had the terrible, wonderful feeling that Evan Krause had written a line into the company's story that Mason never bothered to read. And now, it had just been triggered. The only thing Evan said on his way out was, "Take care." And even that was more reflex than farewell. No anger, no bitterness, just those 2 words, like he was stepping out for coffee, not walking away from a 15-year legacy. I watched from my desk as he made his way down the aisle, the soft thud of his boots muffled by the cheap corporate carpet. In his left hand, the NASA mug. In his right, a slim navy blue folder with a post-it note still half stuck to the front that read, in faded pen, "Founding Docs, do not toss." That folder had been in his drawer for as long as I could remember. No one ever touched it. I'd seen interns nearly dislocate a wrist trying to open that drawer once before he calmly slid it shut and said, "That one stays closed." He didn't look back, not once. He got in his ancient Ford Escape, still bearing the old company parking sticker from 2011, and drove off without ceremony. The kind of exit that doesn't make a sound but leaves the floor feeling hollow. The kind of exit that makes you realize how much one man actually was the floor. No email, no Slack goodbye, just absence. But while the office carried on like nothing happened, Evan's story wasn't ending. It was starting over. Back at his house, somewhere in Worthington, quiet street, brick ranch, yard always trimmed like he measured it with a ruler, he parked, carried the folder inside, and walked straight into the garage. Not the kitchen, not the den, the garage. That's where the old safe was. It was this chunky, fireproof beast wedged between a pegboard of tools and a half-finished engine rebuild he never talked about. I saw it once when he hosted the team for burgers during that weird team-building summer where leadership pretended we were a family. He kept a lawn chair and a small stereo out there, the kind that only plays classic rock and AM sports radio. But in the far corner, behind a stack of old data center tapes and a deflated football, was the safe. He flipped the combo in 3 quick turns. No hesitation, like muscle memory. Inside was another folder, older than the first. The paper had yellowed at the edges. I bet it smelled like dust and toner and time. He laid it out on the workbench, smoothing the creases with care. The top page was a certificate, something with embossed lettering and a blue ink signature from a name I hadn't heard in years. Gregory C. Myers, one of the original founders before the company went corporate. The next page was what mattered. Article 17.4b. Typed in, courier, double-spaced like it was written before templates were a thing. The clause was simple. Legal, dry, but devastating. It said that, in the event any co-founding executive whose name appears on the original incorporation documents is terminated without full executive council sign-off, and without CEO endorsement, their dormant board voting rights, if not previously relinquished, will be automatically reactivated within 48 hours. No review, no hearing, no delay. It was a sleeper clause. One of those just-in-case things legal departments file and forget, except Evan didn't forget. He wrote it, with Greg, back when the company was just 9 people and a leased server rack in a basement. And now, it had been triggered because Mason, God bless his arrogance, never read past the 3rd page of anything that didn't mention his name. And he sure as hell didn't think Operations Lead Number 2 from 15 years ago was anything more than a relic. What he didn't realize was that Evan never cashed out, never sold his founder rights, never even cashed his 2008 equity redemption. He held. And now, because some overconfident peacock needed to make a power move in front of an intern and a few junior staffers, that dormant clause was alive and well. Evan leaned back in the chair next to the workbench, staring at the paper like he was reading an old friend's obituary. But he wasn't grieving. He was planning. He opened the smaller folder, the one he'd taken from his desk, and pulled out 2 more documents. One was a signed copy of the founder IP rights agreement. The other was a timeline of role authorizations. It had initials next to every major executive appointment and termination for the last 15 years. Mason's name wasn't on the approval line for Evan's role termination, and neither was the CEO's. That's when I imagined the gears shifted inside him. The man who walked out of Eastridge that morning was done being underestimated. He picked up his phone, scrolled through a list of contacts I'm guessing most people in the company forgot he even had, and paused on one. Angela L. Forrest, General Counsel, retired. He tapped. She picked up on the second ring. He didn't even say hello. He just said, "I need to talk about 17.4b. And somewhere, miles away, I bet she just smiled and said, "I was wondering when that was gonna come up." Angela Forrest hadn't touched a corporate contract in over 6 years. And yet, when Evan called her that morning, she didn't need a single refresher. Not even a pause to ask which company it was. The moment he said 17.4b, her tone shifted from casual to surgical. "Tell me you kept the original signed packet," she said. Evan didn't respond, just held the phone to his ear and slid a worn manila envelope across his garage workbench, the kind with those little red string closures no one uses anymore. Inside, the original incorporation docs, his founder's status verification, and the clause they both had buried under 4 sub-articles and 2 passive phrasing traps. Intentionally vague to anyone without context, yet rock solid if you knew what you were looking at. Angela whistled through the line. He actually fired you without cross-referencing the articles? He called me obsolete in front of the whole team, said an intern could do my job. Evan replied, his voice steady as ever. There was a pause, then a quiet laugh on her end. Then, I assume you're not calling me to cry about it. No, he said. I'm calling to activate. They coordinated fast. Angela, despite being retired, still had connections inside 2 of the law firms Eastridge regularly used for filings. She didn't need to breach confidentiality to make a few pointed inquiries. Turns out, Mason had skipped the standard termination notification memo entirely. There was no routing through HR legal, no exec council meeting, no CEO signature. Just an impromptu declaration in front of a project team and an auto-generated termination in Workday that bypassed compliance by flagging it as contract non-renewal. That's not just a procedural gap, Angela said. That's a landmine in your favor. She pulled the latest org chart, verified Evan's role still had executive classification, and more importantly, that the termination wasn't coded with executive override, which meant one thing. Mason didn't have the clearance to fire him, not on his own. Angela walked him through next steps like a general reviewing battle plans. Send the clause to the CEO, direct. No gatekeepers. Use a secure line. Remind him it was co-signed by Myers and stored under Board Reserve Protocol 2008A. He'll remember. And Mason? He's already screwed. Just hasn't hit the wall yet. Evan didn't smile. Not exactly, but the side of his mouth twitched like the start of one. He walked back into the house, through a hallway lined with old NASA patches and a few family photos that hadn't been dusted since before the pandemic, and into his den. The fax machine was still hooked up. Evan never trusted email for sensitive documents. Said email was a whisper, and fax was a punch. He slid the original copy of Article 17.4b into the tray. To CEO Peter Alden, private line, RE Governance Clause, activation. A sharp mechanical buzz filled the room as the machine started sending. Beneath the clause, in neat, blocky handwriting, Evan scribbled 4 words, effective immediately, C clause. He stood there, watching the last page slide through, the weight of 15 years now compressed into a few sheets of paper and a blinking transmission complete screen. Peter Alden would be receiving that fax before sunrise. And Evan knew exactly how Peter would react, because Peter was there the day they drafted it. He may have handed the reins to his board years ago, but the man still had a healthy fear of 2 things: SEC violations and founders with good memories. Evan didn't need revenge. He didn't need a scene. He just needed gravity to do what it always did. Bring the arrogance straight back to earth. And with that clause activated, Mason wasn't standing on solid ground anymore. He was hovering above a trap door. By 6:05 a.m., Peter Alden was staring at the fax printout like it had just threatened to swallow the company whole. He sat in his home office, robe barely tied, golf cleats still in his duffel bag by the door. The plan was a 7-hoy tea time with a few investors to smooth over Mason's aggressive posture. His words, not mine. But that plan died the moment he saw the header, Article 17.4b, Governance Clause Activation. There it was, the sleeping grenade, triggered. He didn't bother calling Mason. He didn't even bother calling his assistant. He called Grace Lantham, board secretary since the Bush administration, and Martin Sung, the company's longtime legal counsel, the kind of guy who could quote every clause in the operating agreement like scripture and drank chamomile tea like it was tequila. Meet me at HQ, Peter barked into the phone. Now. 30 minutes later, they were standing in the 18th floor boardroom, blinds half drawn, early sun slicing through like spotlights on a trial scene. Martin flipped through the faxed pages, lips pressed into a thin line. Grace sat rigid, her hands folded over a leather notepad that hadn't seen action since the COVID compliance rewrites. No approval, Martin muttered. Not from you, not from anyone with actual authority. Peter exhaled hard. I told Mason to wait. Told him Evan's status was complicated. You didn't put it in writing, Grace said. She wasn't judging, just stating facts. No, Peter admitted, rubbing his face. I didn't think I had to. Outside that same building, across the parking lot, Evan pulled into his usual spot. Spot number 6, still labeled VP Systems, even though the title hadn't meant anything in years. He stepped out with the same calm posture, same black windbreaker he always wore on audit days. No security tried to stop him. No one questioned his badge swipe. It still worked. Of course it did. Because no one in facilities had been told to disable it. Because no one knew who had actually fired him. And because Evan Krause had built half the systems that kept those doors locked or open. He didn't go to the 9th floor, didn't even look at it. Instead, he stepped into the executive elevator, slid his old access card into the control panel, still coded executive override, and rode in silence to the top. The 18th floor, the penthouse level. The floor where the founders used to argue over roadmaps and dilution, now mostly empty except for investor summits and emergency board meetings. The lounge was still there, half a dozen leather chairs, untouched espresso machine, the quiet hum of HVAC that hadn't been adjusted since 2015, and in the far corner, beneath a framed blueprint of Eastridge's original architecture, was a single walnut desk. Not flashy, not modern, just waiting. No one had sat there in years, but Evan had the key. He pulled it from his pocket, a brass antique-looking thing, not the new digital cards Mason had tried to force on everyone. The lock clicked. The drawer opened. Inside were only 2 items, a sealed envelope marked "For Gov Lead Only" and a notepad with the name E. Krause embossed at the top in fading gold letters. He didn't say a word, just sat. Opened the notepad, and began reviewing the governance matrix like he'd never left. Meanwhile, in the boardroom down the hall, Peter was pacing. If the clause is valid, Martin said, tapping his pen, then not only is Evan's termination void, his board vote is reactivated. And we're legally required to notify the full board within 24 hours, Grace added. Worse, Martin said, he's now technically part of the governance lead panel, which Mason dissolved. Peter paled. That wasn't his call. No, Martin agreed, but he made it publicly, which means Evan's return isn't optional, it's required. Peter glanced toward the hallway. He's already here, isn't he? Martin didn't answer. He didn't need to. Evan had returned. Not with a speech, not with revenge, just with a clause, a chair, a name that never left the system. And as the sun rose over the 18th floor, the quiet man in the corner of the executive lounge became, once again, the axis the company quietly revolved around, not by force, but by design. The boardroom looked like a tech startup had tried to cosplay as a courtroom. Too much glass, too many buzzwords etched into the walls, and an espresso bar in the back no one knew how to use. Mason strutted in like he was walking into a VC pitch. Tan blazer, no tie, expensive watch glinting under the overhead LEDs. You'd think he was about to announce the IPO himself the way he tossed his laptop bag onto the conference table. Appreciate the short notice, everyone, he said, flashing his best LinkedIn smile. Glad we could get this moving before next week's onboarding summit. I know some of you were curious about the recent restructuring. I'll keep it brief. He opened his MacBook, clicked something, and a slideshow popped up on the main screen. First slide. Eastridge Forward, Realignment and Optimization. Below it, a stock photo of a mountain and a quote about courage from Elon Musk. I'm not kidding. Martin Sung's face didn't move. Grace blinked once. Peter Alden didn't even sit. He was standing at the far end of the table, arms crossed like he was watching a house burn down and wondering how much insurance was still valid. Mason clicked to slide 2. Now, you've probably heard that we've begun phasing out legacy roles, positions that, while foundational, no longer align with where we're going. Think cloud native, think AI integrated, think... Who authorized the termination of EK? Peter said, loud enough to slice the room in half. Mason paused, blinked, then chuckled like it was a casual aside. I mean, we had to make some quick decisions to stay agile. I'm sure Evan understood. It was handled. Clean break, no drama. Martin cleared his throat and gently, almost lovingly, slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Mason. Would you mind reading this aloud? He asked. Mason glanced down, then frowned. then reread it. Silence. Peter stepped closer. You terminated a co-founder, Mason, with active board rights, without my sign-off, without any legal review. Mason laughed, nervously this time. Wait, Evan? Wasn't he just a legacy lead? I didn't even know he was... You didn't know, Martin repeated flatly, because you never read the Articles of Incorporation, or the Board Reserve Protocol, or the Founder Clause documentation we emailed you twice when you first got your badge. I was told they were outdated. Mason shot back, voice climbing. That half of it didn't even apply post-Series C. Peter raised an eyebrow. By who? Yourself? Mason's face shifted then, just a flicker. The first visible crack in the swagger. His shoulders stiffened, jaw working like he was chewing a thought he didn't like the taste of. You thought Evan was replaceable, Peter said. But he still held board voting rights. He was still registered in the founder ledger, and because of Article 17.4b, which you triggered, you've now forcibly restructured this board without authority. Martin pointed to the bottom of the document. The clause is self-activating and irreversible. As of this morning, Evan Krause holds the swing vote on all strategic decisions until formal reassignment or revocation by supermajority, both of which require his consent. Mason stared at the paper like it had betrayed him. The slideshow was still on the screen. A bullet point read, Next, consolidate senior roles, streamline governance. Peter looked at the screen, then back at Mason. Your governance just got streamlined, he said coldly. Right out from under you. Mason opened his mouth, but no sound came, because in that moment, it finally clicked. This wasn't just a procedural oopsie. It was a reconfiguration bomb, and he'd pulled the pin himself, on record, in public, in front of the entire damn company. His smirk was gone now. What replaced it wasn't rage. It was realization. He hadn't just fired a guy. He'd tried to delete the wrong name from the codebase of Eastridge itself. And the system corrected him. The tension in the room could have shattered glass. Mason sat there motionless, eyes pinned to the clause like it might rewrite itself if he stared hard enough. Peter had fallen silent too, not out of uncertainty, but because the next voice in the room didn't need his introduction. The door opened with a gentle hiss from the hydraulic hinge. No dramatic swing, no stomping footsteps, just Evan. Same black windbreaker, same calm posture, same eyes that scanned the room without urgency, like he'd been here the whole time. Just stepped out for a coffee and came back to finish what he started 15 years ago. He didn't take the seat at the far end. He didn't head toward Mason's end either. He walked to the chair nearest the ledger book, the one assigned to the governance lead position no one had filled since the restructuring 5 years back. The chair had sat empty so long someone had stashed an unused charger and a stack of onboarding brochures on it. Evan picked up the charger, coiled the cord, and set it neatly on the sideboard. Then he looked around the table, eyes resting on Peter, then Martin, then the last remaining board members who hadn't yet found a reason to speak. Gentlemen, he said, no sarcasm, no venom, just a calm, measured voice. I'd prefer not to return to my old role, he continued. I've built what I needed to build there. But given the governance gap and the current state of procedural integrity, I'd be willing to serve as interim governance lead for the remainder of the transition period. Not one person objected. Grace quietly made a note. Martin nodded once, barely visible. Peter exhaled, subtle, like relief trying not to be seen. And Mason? Mason looked like someone had stolen his air supply. His eyes were wide, lips slightly parted, and his hand, still clutching the now useless presentation remote, twitched like he wanted to rewind time with it. No one offered him the floor. No one asked for his input. He didn't even try to speak. Outside the boardroom, through the glass wall, I saw her. Claire, the intern Mason once said could do Evan's job with half the salary and better fonts. She was standing by the elevator, arms folded tight, visibly trembling as a senior manager handed her a cardboard box. Her eyes were red. She didn't look up, just shuffled toward the exit, her heels clicking softly against the tile. Mason didn't watch her leave. He didn't dare look at anything that reminded him of the role he'd played in all this. Meanwhile, Evan pulled out his own notepad, the same kind I'd seen him scribble on 1,000 times. Corner margins filled with timestamps, action points, internal policy references most people never bothered to memorize. He flipped to a blank page, wrote the date, then calmly asked, "Can we begin with a review of the outstanding executive appointments?" It wasn't a question. It was a return. No vengeance, no theatrics. Just the reclamation of space that had always quietly belonged to him. And the thing about that kind of presence, it doesn't have to raise its voice, because when it shows up, especially in a room full of people who thought they'd buried it, it speaks louder than any speech ever could. Evan didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The room already knew who was in charge. Again. By noon, the board had convened a closed-door vote. Short, procedural, unanimous. Evan's voting rights were formally reinstated, his advisory seat reactivated under the governance reserve clause. The document didn't even need edits. His name had never been removed. It was as if the system had been waiting for him. Martin, ever the minimalist, made it official with a single line on the record. Per activation of Article 17.4b, Evan Krause shall resume oversight authority until formal governance reassignment. Effective immediately. Then came the part no one dared say out loud, but everyone knew was coming. Peter turned to Evan. "We'd like you to review current executive alignment," he said, keeping it neutral. "Advise on continuity, prioritize stability." That was code for, tell us who stays, who goes, and who we've been foolish enough to keep around. Evan gave a single nod. He didn't lean into the moment, didn't swell with triumph. He just pulled out his notepad, same pen, same calm posture, and jotted one word: assessment. Within the hour, Mason's name was flagged in the system for administrative review. And by 1:47 p.m., security was walking him out, not with handcuffs, not with spectacle, but with that cold corporate silence that says, "This isn't personal, but it's over." His badge was disabled before he hit the ground floor. The glass doors that once opened automatically for him now blinked red. He didn't speak as he left. Didn't argue, just kept walking, stunned and stiff, like someone who realized too late that the bridge he was burning was the only one holding him up. Across the building, HR began circulating a quiet memo. Not flashy, not public. Just an internal title update in the org database and an Outlook signature line modification. Evan Krause, Strategic Governance Advisor, no announcement email, no all hands, just presence. The title hit our screens like a whisper through the halls. No one said anything directly, but I saw the ripple. Slack messages stopped mid-sentence. Eyes darted toward elevators. Even the cynical senior devs, guys who never cared about politics unless it involved free pizza, paused when they saw it. Somehow, it was louder than a shout. The same floor where Mason once stood gloating over Evan's so-called obsolescence now sat quiet. Not out of fear, out of recognition. Because we'd all seen it. We'd watched the firing. We'd felt that crackling embarrassment when Mason said, "An intern could do this job." We'd stood there, mute, complicit, when Evan just nodded and walked away. Now, he'd returned. Not through rebellion, not through rage, through protocol, through the very systems Mason dismissed as legacy clutter. And the same man who once said, "We control your career now," had just been erased by a clause Evan wrote in 2008, printed on yellowing paper, and faxed from a machine older than half our dev team. I caught sight of Evan later that day, walking past the analytics pod. Same windbreaker, same mug. He nodded at me, subtle, like we were both in on the same quiet joke. No smirk, no swagger. Just a man doing his job better than anyone else ever had. And this time, the entire company knew it. It was exactly 1 week later when the cameras showed up. Not the usual shareholder fluff or PR spin about innovation, this and AI that. This was a press event that actually mattered. New partners, major compliance contracts, a full reset of Eastridge's leadership alignment. Invitations went out like little digital olive branches, but make no mistake, this wasn't a celebration. It was a public surgery. The company needed to show stability, clarity, direction, and maybe most of all, accountability. The stage was tastefully bare. No brand banners, no company swag. Just a podium, a screen with the new partner logos behind it, and 7 chairs arranged in a clean arc. 6 were filled with familiar names: Peter, Grace, Martin, a few new faces from the incoming investment advisory group. And the 7th? That one sat slightly apart, far end of the arc, just outside the spotlight. Evan. No title card, no fanfare. He didn't even wear a suit, just slacks, button down, windbreaker folded over the back of his chair. The same notepad sat balanced on his lap, a pen nestled in the spiral. I swear, it looked like he was still half prepared to take minutes instead of headlines. Peter cleared his throat at the mic. He looked tired, but less in the way of defeat and more like a man who'd just cleaned out the basement of a 100-year-old house and found something salvageable underneath. We're here to announce a recalibration of leadership, he said. But more than that, we're here because someone reminded us that structure matters, that the systems we depend on, our governance, our integrity, our internal scaffolding, don't run on titles or trend decks. They run on people. He paused, glanced to his left. A silent reformer, he added, made sure this place didn't implode, not by shouting, not by threatening, by simply remembering what we'd all forgotten. A reporter, probably one of the younger ones from a tech blog more interested in failure than function, raised a hand. And who was that? Peter didn't answer at first. He just turned slightly and gestured. Evan looked up, didn't wave, didn't stand, just gave a faint nod, pen still between his fingers, like he hadn't decided yet whether this moment was worth documenting. The room hushed for a second, not out of awe, out of realization. One of the board members, I think it was Elsa Van Dorn from the compliance subcommittee, leaned toward Martin and whispered, loud enough to carry to the first row, "Mason fired the man who built the system he tried to game." No one laughed, because it wasn't funny. It was true. After the event, most of the attendees crowded around the front of the stage, shaking hands, exchanging cards, promising synergy. Evan didn't linger. He quietly stood, tucked the notepad under his arm, and exited stage right. I caught sight of him again 20 minutes later, just outside the executive wing. The glass wall that once bore Mason's name, Mason Alden, CSO, was empty now. The letters had been stripped, the adhesive still faintly visible like a ghost signature. The office sat dark, the desk wiped clean, the chair still slightly swiveled as if someone had left in a hurry and wasn't sure they'd be back. Evan walked past without pausing. Didn't glance through the glass, didn't slow his pace. He just kept moving. That steady, unshaken stride that had somehow remained unchanged through firings, restructures, betrayals, and boardroom power plays. Because some people punch walls, some people scream in Slack, some people storm out, and then there are people like Evan. The ones who don't raise their voice, they don't raise their fists. They just write the rules, quietly, thoroughly, 15 years ahead of schedule. And then they wait. Not for justice, not for revenge, just for someone arrogant enough to trigger the trap. Some people fight back. Others just wait for you to trigger the trap they built 15 years ago.